What's up, family? This is your man, not your boy, GoBlack2Africa. I want to share this video with you all. Just small segments of how the European Jews that come into Africa slowly converts them into Judaism. We have to be careful that when we allow strangers to come into our environments, and what do they leave behind? This trail, this residue of their cultural belief systems, their traditions, and how they might worship, or these idols and these symbols. These things we have to be very careful of. Watch this video, I'll be back.
Many of them actually converted, or their parents converted to Christianity for various reasons, and now they wish to return to be part of the Jewish people. They are not considered as Jews, so they already live as Jews, but officially they are not yet converted, so they're
Sir, come here. You. In the book of Numbers, the Israelites are commanded to wear this called a talit. Yes. But the commandment is not given to women. It's given to the sons of Israel.
We have to, your vision, Rabbi, is very, very important to us. Because the Bible says in the book of Romans, how shall they know when they are not told? And how shall they be told when someone is not sent to them?
Yes.
Exactly.
So how can we know when we are not told?
And that's I think where we have an issue. I was teaching today in Isaiah 18. He said, go be the messenger. He tells to the natural, to the Jewish people that know that, go to your brothers.
Me Indiana Jones about 20 years ago, because I kind of had found these lost tribes in remote parts of the world. I may even have had a leather hat at one point, which I acquired in my African trips. I never had a whip, however. And then I did a movie a few years ago, which had to do with my discovery of something which was very similar to the Ark of the Covenant. And so by this time, the moniker stuck. I had to be the British Indiana Jones. I was lucky to find a new project, which is about the conversos, the Spanish Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity. And there's very good reason to believe that the first Jews, ostensibly converts, arrived in St. Augustine, probably in the first decades of the 16th century. Now, this is intriguing, but my wider project is to write a social history of the conversos throughout the Americas. And this is the kind of thing that I work on. Jewish groups, Judaizing groups, tribes in remote places that think for one reason that they're Jewish, because I'm one of those people that believes that the edges of society, the outer edge of society, are the most interesting things to examine, and they're the parts of society, the parts of history, which are most meaningful. They're drenched in meaning.
The Lord is one. Ye are Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shalom.
Shalom.
Now, I wanted to just give you a depiction. I was in Zimbabwe when I got to go to a fellowship of the Limba people. Now you see the Limba tribe have taken on these beanies on their heads, these symbols of the Star of David that just came into effect in the 8th or 9th century, that has nothing to do with being the children of Israel. You see them now.
Hold up. Hey. Okay. Let me do this. Okay.
En ny kompakt kaffemaskin. En värld av kaffevarianter. 2 espresson, en dubbel espresso eller en dubbel lungo. L'Or Barista kaffemaskin. Oändliga kaffevarianter. Ren njutning.
Lucidchart makes intelligent diagramming easy and helps your best ideas become real. Start from scratch or get started with templates. Shape your ideas with hundreds of
Senna. And they had a kind of epic. It just so happens that Leipzig is the most easterly of the great European Orientalist libraries. But I'm not that kind of scholar. I've had a lot of adventures in my life, and I've had a lot of journeys. And the most exciting of these, in many ways, and this is really rather surprising and astonishing, was in Africa. Now, why should this be surprising? It's surprising because I am a student of Jewish studies, and particularly remote Jewish communities throughout the world. And whereas, of course, there were Jews in places like Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia, and of course, on the Silk Route as far as China, there were no Jews in pre-modern times in Black Africa, with the exception of 1 or 2 references in very, very dodgy medieval texts suggesting that there might be some lost cities and the occasional Jewish king somewhere in the heart of the unknown continent. This is how it happened. I was asked to go to South Africa to give a lecture at the University of Witwatersrand, and it was a hall a bit like this. The place was full of very well-dressed, affluent-looking white South Africans, and they listened very attentively, sitting in their comfortable, well-upholstered chairs to what I had to say. But at the back of the hall, there was quite a large group of very poorly dressed Black people, shoeless, but they were wearing little black skull caps. And after my lecture, I went across, introduced myself, and we started to chat. And they explained that they were members of the Lemba tribe. And then, to my great astonishment again, they said that they were Black Jews who'd come hundreds or perhaps thousands of years before into Africa.
Okay.
Black people, shoeless, but they were wearing little black skull caps.
Okay.
Now, I wanted to just give you a depiction. I was in Zimbabwe when I got to go to a fellowship of the Lemba people. Now, you see the Lemba tribe have taken on these beanies on their heads, these symbols of the Star of David that just came into effect in the 8th or 9th century. of the Limba people. I was in Zimbabwe when I got to go to a fellowship of the Limba people. Now, you see, the Limba tribe have taken on these beanies on their heads. Now, you see, the Limba tribe have taken on these beanies on their heads.
Say. But at the back of the hall, there was quite a large group of very poorly dressed black people, shoeless, but they were wearing little black skull caps.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is we didn't pick it up. We were already wearing these skull caps. Okay. So as one person who was actually in Zimbabwe and you had an opportunity to ask these things, you didn't bother asking these things. And now you're making an ass out of yourself, as usual. Speaking on the side of your mouth, not knowing what the fuck you're actually saying. Okay? Ignorant. Okay? See, you just, like the rest of these black Americans, come with the camera and travel a few countries, you think you woke. You ain't woke. Okay? You speak of South Africa. You do not know the struggle in South Africa. It's so easy for you to say it's worse than America. That's some bullshit. There is no worse place for black people than America right now. Okay? If that includes Libya in its current state today, where there is still a lot of racism and people, Eritreans, Africans, calling themselves Muslims are being mistreated. There is no wholesale slaughter of black people in Africa like you have in America, and by white people and by black people. You see, black people, you need to be in this picture too, because black people kill more black people in America than anywhere else in the world. Where do you get off trying to teach us, a people with no culture at all? You see, there are so many levels to this and how you can integrate with it. You are buying properties in Africa. Some people like me, we build on our own lands. We don't buy houses in Zimbabwe. That's one thing you should have noticed. We build our own. Yes, there are houses for sale in Zimbabwe, a lot of them, that we have built ourselves. There are areas in Zimbabwe you can go and just find construction everywhere. People building their homes. When it comes to these scenarios, even within the Lemba community, it is split. There are those who want to just remain Lemba. You do not speak on that. You see, did you go and get the other side of the coin? There are those who just want to remain limber and have nothing to do with the homeland, the motherland, or this. And like, this is our promised land here, Zimbabwe, Southern Africa. But you only get the narrative that supports your narrative. You see. Then you go on YouTube and say, you see. Like you, the most woke individual walking around in the world right now, GoBlack2Africa. This is your man, not your boy. You behaving more like a boy right now. You see. Being a man is not whether you stated, no. Being a man is when the community says you're a man. You see. When you've been circumcised and you hold a position within the community. That you do good and not say good, because we do not speak of good. It is done. You see. Our ways were called pagan ways. A little bit of research, even on Wikipedia. Okay. Let's get into it. Now, this is your traditional healer in the villages today in Zimbabwe, Africa, the Shona people. So when you give me people like Modric Mayeresera, who is one side of the story, and you don't go and speak to this guy, who is the other side of the story, you have done nothing. You see, you are just as biased as the rest of them. Yeah. See where I'm getting at? Now, let's go to religion. It's actually not religion because it's spirituality, but hey, right? The traditional religion of Shona people is centered on Mwari, God, also known as Msikawan, creator, which is wrong. Right there, I'll tell you it's wrong. Because Mwari is God and Msikawan is creator. These are two different entities altogether, right? Two different entities. Mwari is God, but Msikawan is creator, because the creator is creator of humanity, men, people, right? God is a title that is given to ancestors, okay? These are Mwari. You'll understand soon enough as I read on, because it will clarify itself pretty much, because there's a confusion here, but now that I've kind of said it, you kind of pick it up as we go, right? The traditional religion of Shona people is centered on Mwari, God, also known as Msikawan, creator of men, people, or Nyadenga, one who lives high up. Now, Nyadenga is God, is not the creator Msikawan. God communicates with these people on earth directly or through chosen holy people. At times, God uses natural phenomena and the environment to communicate with his people. Some of the chosen people have powers to prophesy, heal, and bless. People can also communicate with God directly through prayer. Deaths are not losses, but a promotion to the stage where they can represent the living through the clan spirits. When someone dies, according to the Shona religion, which is spirituality, they join the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, they can enjoy their afterlife or become bad spirits. No one wants to be a bad spirit. So during life, people are guided by a culture of Hun. Hun is humanity, right? Or Ubuntu, Hun, it's humanity, a culture of humanity. Okay? Right. That when they die, they enjoy their afterlife. The Bira ceremony, which often lasts all night, summons spirits for guidance and intercession. Shona religion teaches that the only ones who can communicate with both the living and God are the ancestral spirits, or Zava Zimu. You see? So it kind of clarifies at the top where Mwari, Msikavanhu, and Nyadenga are different entities. Because when one joins the afterlife, it is through them using the Bira ceremony that we invite and talk to them, because they are the ones who are intercessors between us and the spiritual realm. Yes, historically, colonialists and anthropologists wanted to undermine the Shona religion in favor of Christianity. You see this? Historically, colonialists and anthropologists wanted to undermine the Shona religion in favor of Christianity. Initially, they stated that Shona or Sena did not have a god. They denigrated the way the Shona had communicated with their god Mwari, the Shona way of worship, and the chosen people among the Shona. The chosen people were treated as unholy, and Shona prayer was labeled as pagan. When compared with Christianity, the Shona religious perspective of afterlife, holiness, worship, and rules of life, Ubuntu or Hunu, are similar. You see this? When compared with Christianity, the Shona religious perspective of afterlife, holiness, worship, and rules of life are similar. So when the European came, all he did was introduce Christianity, but you look at the way we already were practicing or conducting ourselves was Christianity. Before Christianity. Because in Christianity, you are to call on the ancestors. You are to revere the ancestors. Even Christianity does it. So here is a practice older than Christianity, but is Christianity. Although 60 to 80% of Shona people follow Christianity, Shona traditional religious beliefs are still present across the country. A small number of the population practice the Muslim faith, often brought about by immigrants from predominantly Malawi who practice Islam. There is also a small population of Jews. You see. Now, this small population of Jews is because of Christianity. You understand? The Bira ceremony. Bira is an all-night ritual celebrated by Shona people from Zimbabwe in which members of an extended family call an ancestral spirit for guidance and intercession. Shona people believe that the only ones who can communicate with both the living and God are the ancestral spirits, Vadzimu. For you guys, this is the Jesus Christ. This is not a spirit. For you Christians, do you not have the Holy Ghost? And the power of the Holy Ghost. But you are told not to question the Holy Ghost. Yet Solomon called upon his ancestors. Yet Jesus Christ himself called upon his ancestors. What was the transfiguration? If not him calling upon the Holy Ghost. But here is the thing. people can also communicate with God directly through prayer. Yeah. This was also an option, you see. So, despite having all these things where we go through our ancestors, we still had a channel to go through directly to God through prayer. But if we didn't want to use prayer, we would communicate directly with the spirits. Then they communicate directly to God. It was a surefire way because the spirits are in the spiritual realm. So once you talk to the spirits can just take the message directly, quicker. Now, if you want to talk to God, yes, you can still pray. It's okay. You're allowed to do so. So, you're dealing with henotheism that later translates to monotheism. Henotheism, meaning out of the many gods, we chose one. And then monotheism, out of the many people, we became the chosen ones. You see? So it is symbiotic relationship where we choose the one God, then the one God chooses us. You see? So it is not like the one God chose us. No, we chose the one God. Then the one God ended up choosing us. Out of many, we chose one. And out of many, we were chosen. So who knew? Who knew is living the law, the Torah law. Who knew is living the Torah law. So, agriculture. The Shona have traditionally practiced subsistence agriculture. They grew sorghum, beans, African groundnuts, and after the Columbian exchange, pumpkins, sorghum was also replaced by maize and other after crops introduced. Shona people kept cattle, goats, since livestock was important during droughts. Now, we did not start wearing yarmulkes recently. You get an F. Okay, maybe a C minus. I'll give you a C minus. You know, for the attempt. It's not a bad attempt. Now, bit of background. Let's go to YouTube.
Let's try this one for size.
How much do you know about your own history?
Have you finished taking pictures, Mr. Cameraman?
If it pleases the court, my lord, to hear the state's case against the accused persons, Nyahanda, Nyakasakana, and others.
Silence in court. Listen to the proceeding.
Nyahanda, together with her co-accused, are responsible for murdering Henry Pollard on the 18th of June, 1896 in Missouri. Nyahanda is the principal perpetrator who summoned her people to apprehend the Native Commissioner Henry Pollard and chopped his head with an axe.
Vana vemutema vafa kubva zvapinda vasina mabvi munyika ino vawandisa uye havasina mumiririri kubva kupfumo dzvuku rakapinda takavarairwa tichiti zvimwe ihama izvo kwete mapera akauya akapfeka makanda emakwe kubva zvapinda vachena ivavava munyika muno vachitsvaga ushamwari namadzimambo edu takafara tikati zvimwe ihama dzatumwa namusiki kuti dziuye kuti tishande pamwe chete kuti dzitivandudze sezvo iye musiki ndiye akangata akati vagamuchirei asi mukuuya kwavo ivava vakauya nejambwa norushava-shava munyama pakati pevanhu vechitema munyika muno wanikwe pasina kana nguva tatove nhapo munyika yedu yachipikira.
Your worship, the accused purports to be a spirit medium who talks to God.
How do you plead?
Munobvuma here mhosvo iyi?
Hatibvumi.
Hello and welcome back to Power Sessions with Natasha, where we find our confidence, our power, and where we have real conversations. Today we are continuing with our theme of Africa's Queens, and we are going all the way to my country of birth. We are going back to Zimbabwe today, all the way down to Southern Africa. Yay! And today we are talking about Mbuyane-Handa. Mbuyane-Handa, many of us, especially if you're Zimbabwean, have grown up hearing stories about her. I know that some places in Africa and African people, they have heard about her. And her famous words are, "Mapfupa angu achamuka, my bones shall rise." So who is Mbuyane-Handa? Nehanda is actually a spirit, what we call in Shona Eshikiro, or spirit medium of the Zezuru Shona people. She's a Shona Mondoro. A Mondoro is a powerful, respected ancestral spirit. It's something that is very, very, respected in the Shona culture. They call it a royal muzimu, an ancestral spirit or a lion spirit that uses women as her mediums. The mediums are normally given the name or the title Nehanda, Ombuya Nehanda. Mondoro spirits were very revered spirits among the Shona. It was believed that they could interpret the orders and wishes of Mwari. Mwari is the senior deity, which is like God. The original Nehanda was considered to be Nyamita, the daughter of the first Monomotapa Mutota, who was living in the north of Gurue in about 1430. The funny thing is, my grandmother on my dad's side is from Gurue, and it's very ironic that all of this started near there. Mutota was the founder of the Mutapa state. He had a son called Mutope, who later became the second Monomotapa. Matope was Nyamita's younger half-brother, and to increase the power of Matope, Mutota ordered his son to sleep with his older half-sister, Nyamita, who became widely known as Nehanda. The ancestral ritual is believed to have resulted in the increase of Matope's rule and empire. Matope handed over a part of his empire to Nehanda, who became so powerful and well known that her spirit lived on in the human bodies of various spirit mediums until almost 500 years later, when it was believed to occupy the body of the Mazoe Nehanda, who we are going to discuss today. During periods of possession, the spirit medium was believed to be speaking with the voice and personality of the original Nehanda and not with their own. Wow. So let's look at the Nehanda that we are going to talk about today. The Nehanda we are looking at today her name was Charwe Nyakasikana. And famously, she's known as Mbuya Nehanda, So Mbuya Nehanda was a spirit medium that was channeled by Charwe Nyakasikana. She was a Hera of the Watamfokese dynasty. Hera is like a part of the Shona people, Shona group, part of the Shona tribe, the Zulu people. Charwe Nyakasikana was born in 1840 in what is today the Chishawasha district, which is located in Mashonaland Central. She was the daughter of a named man Chitaura, who was the younger son of Shayachimwe. Shayachimwe founded the Wata dynasty in the Upper Mazoe Valley in the late 18th century. By 1896, though, the Chitaura name was held by her brother, whom she lived with, and she was considered to be much more important than him, probably because of her spiritual powers. She had actually been married and had 2 daughters and a son, but the name of her husband was not recorded or cannot be remembered historically. She probably became possessed by the Nehanda spirit in 1884 because her brother's stronghold at that time, in terms of war, was named Nehanda. So, what happened with Nehanda? Why is it that now she is this revered woman? She's this revered person in history for fighting for her people. Well, Nehanda was eventually killed by the British, but why? So, when the British came in the so-called Rhodesia, but now it's obviously Zimbabwe, in 1890, they immediately instituted a regime of rough justice. They took over the local people's land, mines, the cattle. Everything was to do with taxes, paying taxes. It was horrific. On top of that, the local people were forced to work for the English pioneer settlers on their newly acquired farms, mines, factories, under very, very harsh conditions. It was obviously then not surprising that in less than 6 years of British colonial rule, the local people rose up in arms and declared a bitter war on the colonial settlers. That declaration of war on the settlers by the people took the British completely by surprise. The British were asking themselves, how could people that they had always considered docile and cowardly suddenly declare war? They then thought out, what is the issue? They believed that the bad influence of the Mondoros or the Shikiro, the spirit mediums, which the British referred to as witch doctors, had everything to do with the rebellion. Notice the word witch doctors, the demonizing of our culture. These people, the Mondoros, the Shikiros, were were people who we consulted for generations upon generations. But once the British arrived, they called them witch doctors. And that word witch doctors till today takes so much power away from the power of our ancestors and gives so much power to that word. And it just demonizes our own traditions. Anyway, carrying on. The British believed that the Mondoros did not want whites in Rhodesia, hence the spirit mediums were urging people to chase every British settler out. That is what they believed. It had to be these spiritual people. It had to be these people who speak with the gods, who influence the people. They knew when they came there that these people who were the Mondoros, the Shikiros, were actually where the community, the sense of people's identity came from. This is where people took their direction from. So they thought, if we attack those people, we will get the best results. So it was obviously not surprising when they targeted the spirit mediums for murder. Particularly Mbiyanehanda, she was falsely accused of murdering the native commissioner of her district. His name was Henry Howland Poland, who in fact had been killed in battle. So let's go into history and go, what happened? How was she involved in all of this, in the battles and everything? So Wata Chiripanyanga was a chief of the Wata dynasty in 1892. He was an ally of Nehanda. He played a leadership role in the First Chimrenga War of Southern Rhodesia in June 1896. He worked with Mbiyanehanda to organize resistance by the Wata people against British settlers who had invaded their lands at Pagomba in Mazoe Valley. Wata lost the lives of 100 fighters in guerrilla-type battles with the British settlers, losing more than they had triumphed, but the triumph of the Wata people was short-lived. The British reorganized and returned to Mazoe with many soldiers to re-establish control. The British hunted down the leaders of the rebellion. British soldiers went from village to village where they shot and killed any males that fled. They burned several villages and huts and stole cattle and grain. The purge went on for 3 months. And to save their people, Mambowata, Mbiyanehanda, and Mashi came out from hiding and surrendered to the police. You will find out who Mashi is in a moment. There are, however, 3 important factors to kind of look at when you're looking at the whole Mbiyanehanda situation with her role in the Chimurenga. Firstly, is that the different Shona rulers and their people had to make very rapid decisions with the news of the Chimurenga arrived. You know, the central Shona rising began in the second week of June in the middle Mufure Valley, mainly as a response to the news of the Ndebele victories. So, in the Mazoe Valley, the news arrived on the 17th of June, and fighting started the next day. On June 20, it began at Chipadze, 60 kilometers downriver from the Wata Center. On 25th of June, it reached down of Mount Darwin, right? So, for Wata, Mbiyanehanda, and all the other leaders of the Upper Mazoe, a serious political decision had to be made. Do we fight or do we not? What do we do? So they decided to fight. Of course they were going to fight. You understand? Secondly, we have to look at evidence that was put into the trial that the at the beginning of the rising there is the Gombere Shumba, the medium of the Kaguvi spirit, was very influential in certain areas like Chivero, Nyamweda, Jimba, and Eastern Salisbury district, which, this Kaguvi spirit had such influence in telling people that we must fight the British. So when it came to court, they said that, well, the spirit mediums were influencing people to kill the British. They were influencing people to do this. So hence, the Pollard killing, for which Mbiyanehanda was hanged, took place a fortnight after the outbreak. It was a consequence of the wars, but not the cause. She wasn't the cause. During the fighting, a combination of rumors and assumptions led the Rhodesians to believe that Mbiyanehanda had played a major part. So by the time she was captured, her guilt was assumed. Thirdly, on the killing of Pollard, Chare claimed that she had not ordered his death. They called Mbuyane Chare in the legal documents. Mbuyane had never ever ordered his death. But obviously, the people who were at the trial were mostly British people. They said that she had, but there was no evidence in the physical participation in the rebellion, which killed many British people. However, they were tried for the murder of this man called Pollard and some African police officers who worked for the British, and they were sentenced to death. So remember, I said to you, you will find out who Mashi is. Mashi was a British soldier who was of Zimbabwean descent, but he worked for the British Army. He had deserted the British Army to join the rebellion at Mazoe. He was surprisingly pardoned for exemplary behavior after his arrests, which obviously tells us that he was a spy for the British, and he indeed sold out Mbuyane and her party to the British. And so Mbuyane was taken to the gallows on 27th April 1898. It is interesting, though, to note that Judge Watermeyer, who is the man who instructed her hanging, he instructed that Mbuyane was to be hanged by the neck until she died, right? But it is told that Mbuyane actually did not die by hanging. You understand? What actually happened was Mbuyane was blindfolded and shot dead by a squad of white officers. And in oral tradition, a lot of people said that Mbuyane was shot near Majoni. In Shona, we say Majoni. And it's so sad because it wasn't the way that she should have died. She shouldn't have died for that. And in a lot of Zimbabwean tradition, we hear Mbuyane vakachekwa, it's the way that she died. So where is she buried? That is the very interesting thing about this whole story as well. So the British created a cemetery in Harare, and that cemetery is west of Mpedzanamo Flea Market, near the hostels, and it's near Rufaro Stadium. It was opened on 2nd January 1893. The cemetery was divided according to race and religion as well as military background. Black people had their own section, which was to the west, called the native section. Then there are two areas that were marked there. Two of the Africans buried there were of Mbuyane and Sekuru Kaguri of the first Chimrenga. It is interesting to note that not only are Sekuru Kaguri and Mbuyane buried at that cemetery, which is not closed, but also Judge Watermeyer, the man who sentenced Mbuyane death, is also buried there. And supposedly, the man who in fact hung or executed Mbuyane and Sekuru Kaguri, he is also buried there. However, there is one lasting disturbing thing that breaks my heart, is the fact that the remains of Mbuyane and Sekuru Kaguri are still in the United Kingdom. They are being kept as war trophies in London museums. They're expected to be repatriated, but when? It was due to be done this year in 2020. We are still in 2020. And there's over 25 skulls of our revolutionaries that are being held in museums. For what? Mbuyane and Sekuru Kaguri were hanged in 1899 at the height of the white colonial occupation, which they fearlessly fought against. Their remains are still at Westminster Abbey and the National Hero Museums in London. It has been about 40 years, more than 40 years, since we got our independence. And we still haven't brought back the skulls of our icons. And our culture rightly says if a person dies or is killed in a native land, that person can only rest if the body and soul has been united with their roots. It is absolutely incredible that when you go in and you do the research, you find out that there are about 27 heads that were taken and gifted to the British Crown as war medals, heads. We need to take back the remains of our ancestors so that we can reunite their skulls with their roots because they belong at home. Many people might just think that the skulls are not important but they are important. And the funny thing is that the colonialists, they knew that if they take the head, that they have disconnected the connection between the body and the head, and the person will not become a spirit medium. We need the heads of our ancestors to leave these colonial shores and return back home to rest in peace and continue blessing our lands. It is needed. And yet, we have gone through another amazing queen, Mbuyanianda. I urge you to go and look up about her. She's an amazing woman. So much history out there, guys, for us to learn and know who we are. We come from kings and queens. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you on the next one.
Hello everyone. Today we're looking at the timeline of events which led to the First Chimlenga War. This was a 2-year battle which took place from 1896 to 1897 between the British and the Zimbabweans. The war was a result of Zimbabwe's resistance to the British colonization and the harsh conditions they were forced to live with in their own country. For us to understand what really led to this war and what Britain was actually doing in Zimbabwe, we have to go way back in history. This video is part of a 4-part series on the history of Zimbabwe. We will be releasing a video each week, so make sure you don't miss a new episode by clicking on the subscription button below and the notification bell. If you're not familiar with this beautiful nation, it's a country located in the southern region of Africa, landlocked by South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique, and Botswana. It gained its independence from the British in 1980 after 100 years of colonization. Zimbabwe is home to one of the world's natural wonders, the Great Victoria Falls. It is also famous for its large stone structures, and in terms of resources, it has rich farming soil and perfect weather for farming. Maize, wheat, sugar, mostly grain crops. It was actually known as the Great Basket of Africa at some point in history. The country is also rich in a number of minerals, gold included. Here is a fun fact. It is also home to some international celebrities like Danai Gurira. Scratch that. Media has to get it right. Danai Gurira, who played one of the leading roles in Marvel's Black Panther, and Kirsty Kovacs, 7-time swimming Olympic champion, and the list goes on. I only mentioned a few which you might have a good chance of knowing. Now back to our history. 1882, the exploration of Africa. By 1882, the Europeans had already begun exploring Africa and claiming land for themselves. The greatest European influence was found in 2 areas at the time: the Cape Colony and the Free State. The Cape Colony was formed when a bunch of Europeans ditched their African expedition after discovering the tip of southern Africa.
This is some good weather, lads. Let's settle. Yippee! Is that gold I see there, John?
The Congo Free State was controlled by Belgium. It was created with the goal of establishing a trade monopoly in Africa. They exploited ivory, minerals, timber, and labor. Problem: the Free State was the center of Africa, and Belgium essentially cut off free trade from the south and north of Africa. This sparked some friction with Britain, France, and Germany, who were already settled in Africa and used their African settlements to market their Western goods and to exploit African natural resources, which fueled their growing industries in their own countries. Belgium's existence in Central Africa was disturbing this. 1885, the scramble for Africa at the Berlin Conference. To protect the interests of Germany, the first Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, organized a meeting to divide Africa amongst European countries. They drew up African borders which exist till this day. However, Africans were not invited to this meeting and they were never consulted about this. And yet the impact of this conference plays a huge role in the political and economic state of Africa today. During the Berlin Conference, they deliberately curved up Africa into mostly small countries which could be easily overpowered and dominated. The aim was to divide and conquer. The Portuguese and the British divided Southern Africa amongst themselves. The British were in Botswana, South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Africa is still trying to break free from the post-colonial grip of European countries. For example, France coerced its former colonies into signing the Pact for Continuation of Colonization. Experts argue that this pact limits the financial freedom of African countries as it mandates that 50% of the country's reserves should be lodged with the Reserve Bank of France, hence restricting a country's freedom to utilize its own resources and invest as and when it sees fit. In 2019, Chihombori Kwo, former ambassador of the African Union to the United States, highlighted that France takes over 500 billion from African countries based on a pact which they forced African countries to sign before they were granted independence. 1888, the Rad Concession. After the Berlin Conference, the British did not waste time and immediately began strategizing a way of colonizing the southern region of Africa, including Zimbabwe. A trio of cunning British negotiators, Rochford Maguire, Francis Thompson, the language interpreter, and Charles Rad, the leader of the trio, set on a mission to Zimbabwe to negotiate a trade agreement between the British and the Zimbabweans. At this point in time, there were two well-known ethnic groups in Zimbabwe, the Ndebele in Matebeleland and the Shona in Mashonaland. King Lobengula was the leader of the Matebeleland. On arrival,
How original is that? People were not divided, right? There's a big difference from divided and having your own divisions in terms of territory, having your own territorial lands because they are tribal lands. So these tribal lands did exist, but their boundaries always, there are blurs between boundaries always. So when two tribes who speak slightly different languages, slightly different, because Bantu is Bantu. We, the Shona people, we don't have L, we don't have X, and we don't have Q in our lexicon, you see. But the rest of the world, except the Japanese, don't have L, X, and Q, but their neighbors, China, they have it. Same with us, the Shona people, the Sena people. We don't have L, X, or Q, but you've got the Zulu next to us who are full of it. The whole language is clicks. We don't speak like that. With us, Shona people, it's A, E, I, O, U. You see, those are the vowels that we use. A, E, I, O, U. Ra, re, ri, ro, ru. We don't have la, le, li, lo, lu. So when you say lemba to us, it's remba. Only the foreigners call us lemba. And most lemba people don't bother correcting people. They just roll with the punches. As for the word Shona as well, which is originally Sena, you find it was Mzilikazi because he is Nguni. He speaks Nguni language. He could not pronounce Sena, so he pronounced it as Shona. So when the British came, they also, and the Portuguese, pronounced it as Shona. So Sena was lost, you see. Now the children of Sena are the true Israelites, you see. And we have totems to prove it. Our totems have poems, and within these poems embedded our history, you see. So mitupo,
The British trio had to wait for a full month before meeting with King Lobengula, as he was reluctant to meet with them. Determined as they were, they implemented a number of things to complete their mission successfully. The trio bribed a close ally of Lobengula, a missionary named Charles Helm. They also brought in another missionary, John Moffat, who was mainly known because of his father's reputation, Robert Moffat, to assist them in negotiating and influencing Lobengula to view the trio in a favorable manner. What you have to understand is Christian missionaries had already settled in some parts of Africa and were known as good and trustworthy people who brought the message of God. They were trusted by kings and queens. If the trio could get them on their side, they too would receive the same respect from African leaders. It is rumored that Moffat was not aware of the trio's hidden agenda to exploit the country's minerals and their colonial interests. All he knew was that this was a friendship between two countries. The trio also bribed two of Lobengula's Ndunas, meaning generals, Loshte and Skombo. What were they bribed with? Alcohol and other items, which were very foreign to them at this point in time.
No, alcohol was not foreign to us at all. It was not foreign to us. They were promised power, you see. They were promised power.
In return, Loshte and Skombo were to lie during translations between the trio and Lobengula and assist in persuading Lobengula into signing an agreement. After a month of all sorts of trickery and deceitful tactics, Lobengula began negotiations which led to the signing of what is known as the Rad Concession.
Did you see what was written on that coach? Zambezia.
This document sealed the fate of Zimbabwe as a British colony at this point in time. The British were granted ownership of all metals and minerals in the country and could do whatever they wanted to extract the minerals from the ground. The greatest misconception about King Lobengula is that he was a weak leader who simply signed the country over to Britain because of some sweets, sugar, and alcohol. And this is how he is portrayed in contemporary literature. He was actually a great and powerful leader who had the best interests of his people at heart. He had the strongest army in the country at the time, and this is because the Ndebele were descendants of the Zulu people from South Africa. They had the best war tactics, which made use of the prominent short spear and shield. Lobengula was seen as the strongest opposition to Britain's colonial.
They are not descendants of the Zulu people. They are a breakaway from the Zulu people. There's a big difference here. Because when you say they are descendants, you are bringing forth another time. Yet Mzilikazi broke away from Shaka, you see. So they are a breakaway, not the descendants of. Put that in chronological order also.
On your interest in Zimbabwe. This explains why Rhodes approached
You can't escape it also. Chronos, meaning the god of time under the Greeks.
him to discuss the future of Zimbabwe, despite the fact that Matabeleland constituted less than half of the country. The terms of negotiations were never fully explained to the king. The document was written in a foreign language, English. Hence, he could not read the terms. Verbally, he was promised so many things for his people, including European medicine, firepower, and a trade friendship with Britain. The trio even lied about their intentions behind their interests in Zimbabwe. When King Lobengula realized what he'd actually signed and agreed to, he was furious. He killed one of his indunas and sent representatives to the Queen to explain that he had not agreed to sign away his country. The Queen's response was anything but helpful, as she told him, "A king gives away a cow, not the whole herd." Upon return to Britain, the three negotiators, Rochford Maguire, Francis Thompson, and Charles Rudd, were knighted as they had acquired land for the British Empire. 1889, the launch of the British South Africa Company. In 1889, the British South Africa Company was formed to administer the effective occupation of Southern Africa by the British, to act as the police force which would help to develop settlements for European settlers. Again, the Africans were not consulted in these colonial processes. The company was owned by a British man, Cecil John Rhodes. It began by operating in South Africa and later moved on to Zimbabwe with the Rudd concession in hand to show their claim on the land. This was known as the Pioneer Column. 1890, the Pioneer Column. The Pioneer Column was led by Cecil John Rhodes, the owner of the British South Africa Company. Under this company, the British migrated from South Africa to Zimbabwe. As they traveled, they would hoist the British flag in certain areas to symbolize colonialism. This was done in Fort Victoria, now known as Masvingo, in Fort Chata, now known as Chivu, and in Salisbury, now known as Harare. They named the country Rhodesia after Cecil John Rhodes. As soon as the British settled, they began practicing agriculture and searching for minerals. Initially, they were welcomed by the people and were only seen as traders. They were even welcomed by Mbuyane Handa, a great spiritual leader for the Shona people. She was a spirit medium, Shukiro, and she channeled a royal female ancestral spirit named Nehanda. She was well respected by King Lobengula and had great influence in the region. She occupied an important and influential position in the religious hierarchy in Mashonaland. She is actually the only recorded woman known to have held such a significant position during the 19th century. Eventually, this welcome was strained as the British continuously increased in number and forced the natives to relocate as they occupied the land of their choice, for instance, good farming land. And they forced the natives to work in their fields and workshops by imposing taxes on them, which were known as the hard tax. To create manual labor, to build new towns, railways, and work in rapidly developing mines, they imposed a tax on each household payable in money, labor, grain, or stock, and was highly beneficial to colonial authorities. The British also did not acknowledge or recognize pre-existing political structures in Zimbabwe. The Zimbabweans began resenting the British. Nehanda, with the help of another medium, Kaguri, openly pointed out that the cause of all their problems was the white man. They also spread the message that God had decreed that the white man should be driven out of the country, that the people had nothing to fear because God would turn their bullets into water. For people who were used to fighting with spears and crossbows, firepower was the white man's unfair advantage, so they held back on starting a war. 1895, the Jameson Raid. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the British claimed they were being mistreated by the Boers. The Boers were Dutch settlers who had arrived in the Cape Colony in the 1600s and claimed the same land the British were after. The British South Africa Company sought to mend this by enforcing their rule in South Africa via their police force. This was known as the Jameson Raid. But the raid was a complete flop, as the British were received by a prepared Boer army, and they immediately got defeated and imprisoned. Rhodes was forced to resign as the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and was on the verge of losing the British South Africa Company. When the Ndebele in Matabeleland heard the news that the British South Africa Company had been defeated, they realized that the white man was not invincible. They too could fight the British South Africa Company and win. On top of this, only 40 soldiers remained in Rhodesia. The rest had left for the Jameson Raid in South Africa, so it was a good time to attack the settlers and drive them off once and for all. With Nehanda, Kagui, and Mukwati leading the resistance for the Zimbabwean people, a rebellion was initiated in Zimbabwe. This kick-started the battle known as the First Chimrenga War in 1896. I hope you enjoyed the video. In the cold winter evening of June 1896, Zimbabwean warriors, including women and children, waited silently for a signal from the chief to attack a European settlement. This marked the beginning of their fight for freedom. They camouflaged their bodies with dark ashes and wore black beads as part of their traditional war regalia. When the signal was given, they attacked the settlers. This was a national simultaneous attack by both the Ndebele and the Shona on the British settlers across Zimbabwe. The British had taken over ownership of the whole country and forced Zimbabweans to pay rent to live on Zimbabwean soil. They had gradually displaced them from their fertile land, looting their livestock in the process. At the end of the First Chimrenga War, cumulatively the white settlers had looted 320,000 cattle from the Ndebele, equivalent to a whopping $160 million on today's market, and more than twice as much from the Shona, who were majority of the population. They took over other type of livestock, mineral reserves, and disrupted the booming economic trading activity, which was happening between the Zimbabweans and the Portuguese in Mozambique. This massive wealth transfer basically created a peasant population, a poorer version of the black people in Zimbabwe, who were left with no choice but to work for the white settlers under harsh and tough conditions, so they could afford rent and food. The simultaneous attack by the Ndebele and the Shona caught the British settlers off guard. They described it as an incredibly well-laid plan, which was sudden and well-coordinated. It was the best well-kept secret between the Shona and the Ndebele. The two ethnic groups were divided because of their history together. Upon arrival in Zimbabwe, the British had exploited this friction. So how in the world did these two come together and create such a successful plan? Had the settlers underestimated the Shona people's fighting spirit? Were they secretly planning a resistance under the radar? On top of this, the British had finally conquered the Ndebele in the 1993 Matabele War, leaving them without a king. So how did they come together to ambush them? Do you know about the Ndebele Queen Lozike, the powerful senior queen who took leadership after Lobengula and rallied the Ndebele warriors into the First Chimrenga War? To answer these questions, we are going to go way back to the early 1800s and build up a timeline of events which took place in Zimbabwe till the end of the First Chimringa War. This is part 2 of a 4-part series on the history of Zimbabwe, so make sure you watch the first episode, the timeline of events which led to the First Chimringa War, to understand some of the topics which we will touch on. I'll be adding 2 more videos, so make sure you don't miss an episode by clicking the subscription button below and the notification bell. The Ndebele and the Shona in Zimbabwe. The Shona were the first inhabitants of Zimbabwe. By the 1800s, they had built a strong economy founded on the lifestyle of their ancestors, the Khoisan and the Bantu, who were skilled hunters, gatherers, and farmers. They also engaged in a number of industrial activities, including iron mining, the manufacturing of basic tools such as spears, cloth production, and cattle rearing. Local and international trade was a major part of the economy. They traded with the Portuguese in Mozambique. They also traded in their livestock for other items such as millet, groundnuts, cowpeas, and bananas from Indonesia. Towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the Shona lost part of their territory when the Ndebele came into the picture and settled in the southern region. The Ndebele were warriors who were descendants of the Zulu people in South Africa. Their founding father, King Mzilikazi Khumalo, was considered to be the second greatest Southern African military leader after the great and prominent King Shaka Zulu. Originally, he was a lieutenant in King Shaka's army. In 1823, he had a dispute with the king and rebelled against him. From 1823 to 1840, they are known to have settled and moved from Mozambique, the Transvaal, Zambia, and Botswana. As they moved settlements, they would absorb members and livestock of other groups, eliminating all opposition and reorganizing captured territory to suit their order. In 1840, they finally settled in Zimbabwe, dividing the country into Mashona land, occupied by the Shona, and Matebele land, occupied by the Ndebele. As per their tradition, the Ndebele would raid Shona livestock and graze. After witnessing the Ndebele raids, a European missionary, Moffat, wrote, all the poor Mashonas who are on the brink of extinction from the Matebele raids. It should be noted that other historians argue that these raids were not as excessive as they were portrayed by Europeans, who used this to divide the two ethnic groups. The Ndebele had their own livestock-based economy, and they received tribute from surrounding chiefs in the southern region of Africa. We will never know the severity of these raids, but it is clear that the Shona feared the Ndebele and their military prowess. As discussed in part 1 of this series, the British South Africa Company officially came into the picture under the Pioneer column in 1890 with the Rudd concession in hand to claim land in Zimbabwe. Because of reports from missionaries such as Robert Moffat and Charles Helm, when the British South Africa Company arrived in Zimbabwe, they were fully aware of the friction between the Shona and the Ndebele. They set out to exploit this friction by deliberately settling in Mashonaland in a quest to manipulate and deceive. They avoided settling in Matebele land since this would immediately spark a war with the Ndebele, who were now fully aware that they had been tricked to sign the Rudd concession that gave away their land. On top of this, King Lobengula also had fierce military forces which made use of the Zulu short spear and shield. The Shona used the less effective longer throwing spear, which you would throw and retreat. With the short spear, the Ndebele used a light shield to get in close range with the enemy, stab them, and immediately move on to the next opponent. Upon arrival in Mashonaland, the white settlers were welcomed by the Shona, who simply viewed them as traders who had come to settle temporarily. They likened them to the Portuguese, who had settled in Zimbabwe in the 1600s and 1700s for a while and gradually moved on. In addition to this, the frequency of the Ndebele raids on the Shona decreased. as King Lobengula deliberately avoided starting a war with the British South Africa Company, which had superior firepower. Because of this, in the short run, the Shona mistakenly perceived the white settlers as their allies. However, things took a turn when the Shona realized that the British were here to stay and were displacing them in their own country. Under the leadership of the British South Africa Company and Cecil John Rhodes, Leander Starr Jameson, a Scottish colonial politician, became the administrator of Mashonaland. Under his rule, the British did not show any respect towards the existing Shona government structures, culture, and traditions. According to tradition, all land belonged to Mwari, meaning the Shona god, and therefore could neither be sold nor bought. The British ignored this and declared the Zimbabwean land as the property and asset of the British South Africa Company. Chiefs were advised they would retain their positions as leaders, but now under the British South Africa Company. They would also be allowed to go back to the ancestral land, but only as tenants, without any legal rights to it, and therefore subject to evictions at any point in time. Local leaders were stripped of their dignity and position in society. Elders and community leaders were disrespected, something which went against their traditions and values. To pave a way for more European settlers from Britain, they further angered locals through mass displacements, which forced the Shona to move from fertile regions into arid and unproductive reserves. Fertile land was allocated to white people only. Dr. Felix Muchemwa wrote in his book, The Struggle for Land in Zimbabwe. Through raids on the Shona, each member of the pioneer column was granted 3,000 acres or 1,320 hectares of free farm land. Zimbabweans had their own culture and governance systems, which were removed and criminalized by Europeans. For instance, normal life-supporting activities, such as hunting of wild animals for the purposes of feeding the family, were now outlawed and termed as poaching. This was simply absurd, as the Shona were hunters. The British came to Zimbabwe empty-handed and had no economic base to colonize Zimbabwe, so they had to use dubious methods to get cattle and other livestock from the natives. Indigenous people were now expected to limit their domestic animals to populations determined by white settlers and enforced by the British South Africa Company's police, thus allowing them to freely raid livestock from black villages. Keeping more cattle than what was authorized by colonial settlers was punishable by the confiscation of the excess cattle and providing force-free labor for the settlers. This, amongst other policies they implemented, disturbed the Shona from trading with the Portuguese. The hard tax was introduced by Rhodes in 1892, and blacks became tenants or renters on what was now British land. Failure to pay this tax had heavy penalties. Collectors favored the method of payment in the form of cattle, goats, and sheep, or work for 2 months. All these items would go to the white settlers' wealth. They also accepted monetary payments. However, they made black people work for low wages. Hence, they were forced to give away all their livestock to keep up with the taxes. Oppressive methods of labor control in British mines and farms were implemented. The blacks would be beaten by shamboks. There were 1 or 2 officers in the body of police in each district. This rendered the Shona much more liable to labor and tax exactions. Police force spread across Mashonaland and was backed by the Native Department created by the British South Africa Company. This system was similar to slavery. One thing is clear, the British settlers were wary of the Ndebele. And here is why. The Ndebele had a powerhouse and a strong military base, which was going to cause problems for them sooner or later. Remember, the Ndebele were trained warriors and conquerors who had been trained under King Shaka Zulu's military. Do you honestly think they were going to sit around whilst the British invaded their home? Adding on to this, the Ndebele kingdom in Matabeleland was still intact and was not under the British rule. This stopped the British from implementing a number of things. They could not explore Matabeleland in search for the second El Dorado. This was an area which was reportedly rumored to be rich with gold reserves. They had not found it in Mashonaland and assumed it was definitely in Matabeleland. The Ndebele were settled en route to South Africa, so the settlers could not use this shorter route to travel and communicate with their peers in South Africa. The Ndebele kingdom also overarmed the region where the British wanted to build a railway line to Mafikeng at low cost. As long as the Ndebele kingdom was alive, this was not possible. The Ndebele did not agree on the boundary which the British had placed to cut Mashonaland from Matabeleland. Jameson had declared the border to be at Umnyati and Shashi River. King Lobengula did not respect this version of the border. Because of the continuous raids on their other militarily inferior chiefdoms in the southern region of Africa, the Ndebele had thousands of cattle. The British were after these cattle so they could boost their own new economy in Zimbabwe. On top of this, Rhodes wanted to gain glory back home, to have conquered and controlled the entire Zimbabwe for the British. Hence, he desperately desired to control Matabeleland. The Ndebele raids on the Shona clashed with the white settlers' intentions for the Shona. The settlers needed them as laborers in their mines and industry, whilst the Ndebele considered Mashonaland as a raiding ground. The British would be angered when the Ndebele raided the Shona, as the Shona would run away to secluded places, leaving the British mines and factories unattended. A war between the British South Africa Company and the Ndebele was inevitable. However, despite all of this, Rhodes and Jameson delayed starting a war to force the Ndebele into submission. This was done to prevent loss of confidence in Britain's future territory, Zimbabwe. On the other hand, King Lobengula restrained himself from beginning an outright war with the British South Africa Company because he knew that their weapons, including rifles and dynamite, were not a match for their traditional weapons. Lobengula's warriors were trained to attack in massed ranks. He reportedly could muster 80,000 spearmen and 20,000 riflemen armed with Martini Henry rifles, which were modern arms at the times. However, poor training meant that these were not used effectively, and he would be going up against the British South Africa Company, which had more than 750 troops in their police force, with an undetermined number of possible colonial volunteers and an additional 700 Tswana allies from Botswana. I could not find a reason why the Tswanas were assisting the British in fighting the Ndebele. However, this could be because they were being paid, and this was part of the divide and conquer European strategy, separating the same people to weaken them. An example of this is what happened in South Africa.
You said divided people are easy to rule. You said that's how
Yes.
apartheid was able to exist. Can you expound on that?
But one of the greatest things that apartheid did within its world, it's so frustrating, is how powerful it was, because it taught, or what it did was it sowed seeds of discontent among people who were the same. That was the power of apartheid. You must remember, Black people are 90% of the population in South Africa. How do you govern 90%? How do you keep them oppressed? Well, what you do is you convince them that they are not one. You convince them that they are all different groups. So you
Class.
split them up. So you go, no, we did it tribally. So we went like, oh, it's Zulu, it's Tswana, it's Pedi, it's Tsonga. We separate the people. You live there, you live there, you live there, you live there. And then what you do is you separate people who are mixed now. So you go like, okay, yeah, I don't care if your parents are mixed. You're a new race. We're going to call you colored. Essentially, that is the best thing. We're all fighting in this world. And you start to realize, you go like, where is it coming from? Why is it happening? So you go like, oh no, you're holding us back. No.
Separate the people so they would never communicate and rally up against the colonialists. Matters came to a head when Lobengula approved a raid to forcibly extract tribute from a Mashona chief in the district of the town of Fort Victoria, which led to a clash with the British South Africa Company. Before this, for an unknown reason, but possibly as a rebellion to the British, The Shona had cut half a kilometer of their telegraph wire under the headman Gomorrah. As a punishment, the settlers requested a payment in the form of cattle. The cattle used to fulfill this payment allegedly belonged to Lobengula and had been given to the chiefs under the Kuronzera system, meaning the borrowing and lending system. Lobengula protested against the Shona chief, who eventually took the cattle from the British and returned them to King Lobengula. This reminded the British South Africa Company of Lobengula's prominence. The last straw was when Chief Mere refused to pay tribute to Lobengula, who then sent an army to punish him, but with the instruction not to interfere with the white settlers. However, the attack brought the settlers' mining and agriculture activities to a standstill, as their Shona labor had fled for safety. Jameson requested the Ndebele commanders to withdraw, but they did not react fast enough. He sent Captain Lendi to drive out the invaders, but instead he fired shots at the Ndebele army, killing Mngandani, a senior Ndebele army commander. This infuriated King Lobengula, and things escalated into a war as the Ndebele retaliated and began fighting the British. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it informative. Don't forget to leave a like and stay tuned for part 2 on the continuation of the First World War. So far in the timeline of the history of Zimbabwe, we have talked about the Shona, who were the first inhabitants of Zimbabwe, and the Ndebele, who migrated from South Africa and settled in the country in 1840. By this time, Europeans had already started exploring Africa, claiming land for themselves. After clashing and fighting for the ownership of African land, Europeans had a meeting known as the Berlin Conference, where they divided Africa amongst themselves. This is also known as the Scramble for Africa. The British were in most of the southern region of Africa. They immediately sent a trio led by Charles Rand to deceive the Zimbabweans into signing the Rand Concession, which gave the British land rights to Zimbabwe. They later traveled to Zimbabwe in what was known as the Pioneer Column and settled amongst the Shona in Mashonaland, whom they exploited and ill-treated. To conquer the whole country, they sparked a war with the Ndebele in Matabeleland, in what was known as the Matabele War, which we are discussing in this episode. So make sure you watch the previous episodes to get a full background of what we'll be talking about today. The Matabele War, also known as the First Matabeleland War, or the War of Disposition, was between the Ndebele and the British South Africa Company and started in 1893. The war began with serious preparations from both sides. Lobengula recalled his army, which was on a mission outside Zimbabwe. He positioned them strategically in areas covering Fort Salisbury, Fort Victoria, and Bechuanaland, around his land Matabeleland. In total, he had 18,000 men. Led by Commandant Colonel Gold Adams, the British settlers also positioned their army at Fort Salisbury under Major Forbes, Fort Victoria under Captain Alan Wilson, and in the Lower Veld under Captain Rafe. The British had 1,100 troops. Rhodes had sent 1,000 troops on horses from the Cape Colony. In addition to this, they were assisted by 200 Tswana from Bechuanaland, now known as Botswana, and there were volunteers from the Cape Colony and 400 Shona who already resented the Ndebele. The Victoria Agreement was signed by all white settlers who participated in this war. This agreement stated that they would each get 6,000 acres of free land, 15 gold claims, and a share of cattle to be looted from the Ndebele people. On 25 October 1893, the Ndebele attacked a British lagger in Matebeleland at night. And from the beginning, it was clear that the Ndebele spears were no match against the white settlers' firepower. The Ndebele suffered a heavy loss of their men, whilst the British had no casualties. The settlers began their march to seize the Ndebele capital. The Ndebele were repelled from all their points in Matebeleland towards Lobengula's capital. True to their fighting spirit, the Ndebele did not give up. They would strategize after every loss and return back to the battlefield. On 31 October 1893, the Ndebele came to Bembesi by the night and ambushed another lagger there. The battle was severe and lasted throughout the night. But the Ndebele lost once again. They had firepower, but they did not know how to use it effectively, and they had a limited supply of ammunition. When Lobengula heard that 3 of his military units had been defeated, he panicked and fled from the capital on 4 November 1893. This marked the fall of the Ndebele kingdom for the British settlers and the official colonization of the whole of Zimbabwe by the British. They hoisted their flag in Bulawayo. Matebeleland and Mashonaland were combined to form Rhodesia in honor of the British South African Company leader, Cecil John Rhodes. A British South Africa Company administration was set up in Matebeleland, headed by Jameson, who was already in charge of Mashonaland at the beginning of 1894. The white settlers continued to pursue Lobengula to capture him through Captain Wilson, but the Ndebele tracked him down and killed Captain Wilson and his team. Lobengula was never captured. He died in 1894 of smallpox and a hunted fugitive, a true heartbreak for the Ndebele people. The British stopped the Ndebele from appointing a successor for Lobengula, hence leaving them without a king. They made sure the Ndebele would never get a chance to come together and rally another powerful army. After the war, the Ndebele kingdom had been greatly weakened and a significant population displaced. The British Loot Committee was formed in March 1894 to raid the Ndebele farmers and loot land, mines, and a staggering 280,000 cattle. The British South Africa Company police force was introduced in Matebeleland. The Ndebele were forced to abide by the same harsh laws set already in Mashonaland, including the tax system. Failure to pay tax resulted in forced labor. After 1894, mining activity increased sharply. More European farmers migrated from Britain to Zimbabwe and would be given good farming land upon arrival. The blacks were displaced and moved to areas which had bad farming soil and poor rains. Jameson created the Native Department, which was in charge of coercing black labor and collecting tax. The British South Africa Company continued to exploit the friction between the Ndebele and the Shona on the assumption that a divided people would never plan to rally against them. They recruited black police officers who were to work solely for the British government. The Ndebele would police the Shona, and the Shona were placed in charge of policing the Ndebele. On top of this, the white settlers were free to do whatever they pleased. They would sexually abuse black women and would forcefully take them as concubines. There was no implemented law to protect the blacks, hence it would go unpunished. However, a black man seen with a white woman was deemed to have committed a crime punishable by death. The settlers built the railway line they had always dreamed of, which passed through Matebeleland to Cape Town. The British South Africa Company increased the company's share value and was saved from bankruptcy by the Ndebele cattle, which they looted after the war. Communication channels were introduced in Matebeleland as a telegraph line was erected in Bulawayo. The story is just beginning. Unbeknown to the British South Africa Company, the Ndebele had not given up. After the disappearance of Lobengula, his wife, Senior Queen Lozikei, secretly took up commandship of what was left of the Ndebele army and was fully determined to get their land back. So stay tuned for the next episode, which will be on the uprising of the Zimbabwean people, which led to the First Chimrenga War. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like below. Hi guys, in the previous episode we talked about the Matabele War between the Ndebele and the British South Africa Company. This episode picks up the timeline from where we left off after the war in 1894. In this episode we are going to introduce two key players in our timeline. The first one, the Ndebele Queen Lozikei, and I'm pretty much sure this is the first time a lot of people have heard of this name. And why is this so? She was a powerful senior queen who took leadership after the disappearance of Lobengula and rallied the Ndebele warriors into the First Chimrenga War. The second key role player I'm going to talk about is Mukwati. He was the visionary and strategist behind the First Chimrenga War. He is the mastermind behind the first secret alliance between the Shona people and the Ndebele people. He was known to have given the British settlers a torrid time. Just an interesting fact here, the Mukwati building, a massive 21-story building located in Harare, is named after him and serves as present-day government offices in Harare, Zimbabwe. Just something to quickly note before we dive into our timeline. As discussed in a previous episode, Zimbabwe was actually known as Rhodesia at this point in time. Even the city names were different back then. They had all been named by the British South Africa Company. The country and city names were only changed when Zimbabwe received its independence in 1980. In my videos, I'm going to refer to the country as Zimbabwe before independence. Unbeknown to the British South Africa Company, after the disappearance of Lobengula, his wife, Senior Queen Lozikei, secretly and strategically stepped up, assumed command of what was left of the army, and became the Queen Regent of the Ndebele people in a time of crisis. The Queen is part of a collection of strong, influential, and remarkable royal African women in our history. She was known to be firm, confident, and assertive. She was described as a dangerous and intriguing woman in her biography by Clark Enyati in 2013. Her role in the country's resistance has been ignored and marginalized by mainstream history. Queen Lozikei was a key player behind the scenes. She led the Ndebele people with such discretion that even the oppressive forces themselves did not understand her role. After Lobengula, the British South Africa Company had stopped the Ndebele people from appointing a successor to ensure that the Ndebele warriors would never get another chance to come together and rally another powerful army. Therefore, Queen Lozikei had to conceal herself and her position from the European settlers. Even European writers were not aware of her power and influence behind the scenes. Queen Lozikei was married to Lobengula to strengthen his military base, as her family, the Dlodlo, were military experts. As soon as she got married to Lobengula, she assumed the position of a military strategist and a highly respected senior queen for the people. From the day she took up this role, she never stopped fighting for her people. After the land and livestock dispossession of the Ndebele people in 1894 in the Matabele War, Queen Lozikei was resolute in her vision for a reinstated Ndebele kingdom and return of her people's land and livestock. Despite their previous tough loss, she took the initiative of rallying the Ndebele for yet another war against the British South Africa Company. She instructed her twin brother, Muntuani Dlodlo, to begin rebuilding the Ndebele's military unit. The queen carefully stored some of the ammunition which had not been used by Lobengula in the Matabele War in preparation for the next uprising. The Ndebele people's fighting spirit was boosted when they heard that the British South Africa Company, led by Jameson, remember Jameson was placed in charge of Rhodesia by the British South Africa Company, and he had been defeated by the Boers in the 1895 Jameson raid in the Cape Colony, South Africa. This showed the Ndebele people that the white man was not invincible. They too could go to war and win. Provided their past experiences with fighting the British South Africa Company, the Ndebele knew that this time around they needed a different strategy. You cannot repeat the same thing over and over again expecting different results. The only way they could successfully dethrone the British South Africa Company was if they collaborated with the Shona people. March 1896. After the Matabele War, the country faced a serious drought which halted most of the farming activities and saw the death of massive cattle herds, thus leading to a period of famine for the Zimbabwean people. This only added fuel to the fire, as most of the population had been relocated to non-fertile land under the British regime. The British South Africa Company had taken most of the people's livestock, so they did not have much to live on. The Shona traditional religion played a prominent role in the lifestyle and identity of the people. A great strategist and spirit medium, Mukwati, used his influence and position as the leader in the Mwari religion to send the message that God, Mwari, had told him that indeed the cause of all their problems, including the drought, was because of the white men. Therefore, the British settlers had to be driven out of the country. God would be with them as they did so. Mukwati shared his vision, and his vision was to create an alliance with the Ndebele and the Shona in order to dethrone the British South African Company. When he approached the Ndebele people with this strategy, they immediately jumped on board, as they had already been secretly training for a war to avenge the death of their people and to take back their land from the British South Africa Company. Meanwhile, the Shona's resentment of the colonial settlers grew exponentially by the day. From 1894 onwards, resistance was more visible amongst the Shona people, with isolated incidents of rebellion. There was localized resistance on individual Europeans, and the British South Africa Company would immediately crush these small uprisings and threaten anyone who attempted to rebel against them. Remember, the Shona people's lifestyle revolved around farming and trading. They did not know much about war strategies as the Ndebele, so they could only do as much. April 1896. The planning for the uprising was set in motion. The Ndebele set up the Mukwati headquarters in Matabeleland, which was going to be the central meeting place for the uprising in Matabeleland. Mukwati made his first step to discreetly begin communications with the Shona under the British radar. The Shona leaders welcomed this conversation with open arms. They too were ready to set their differences aside with the Ndebele and fight their common oppressor together, fight for their land, and fight for their freedom. In the next episode, we're going to explore these secret meetings and gatherings which took place between the Shona and the Ndebele and their strategy for the First Chimrenga War in great detail, highlighting more key players such as Mbuyane Handa Nyakasikana, Sekuru Kagoi, Chief Bonda, and Chief Mashiamombe. So stay tuned for the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching.
My feeling is so bitter that at the moment I feel I've no more tears. I feel I want to revenge. Anything. Sometimes I even take a plate or a sugar basin and I throw it down. That's how I feel at the moment. I feel I've gone stone. I've turned to stone.
An intensive manhunt by Rhodesian police and troops has so far failed to reveal the murderers of Mrs. Haywood's son and daughter-in-law. It's an area of scattered, isolated farms, where today the white inhabitants are asking themselves whether this is an isolated incident or the start of a major terrorist campaign. Mrs. Morag Hudson lives on Lochte Farm in the remote bush country 60 miles southwest of Salisbury. She's a first-class shot. The other day, she shot a kudu antelope right through the heart at 150 yards. That's up to Bisley standards. She was brought up in Portuguese East Africa and has been used to the wilds of Africa all her life. Her husband, Brian Hudson, came to Rhodesia to farm from England 10 years ago. Every Rhodesian farmer knows how to handle a gun. Most of their wives do too. They've always shot for sport and for the pot. Now they have to be ready to shoot in self-defense. Terrorism has come to Rhodesia in the past few months. It's only just beginning, but it could get much worse. Although for the moment, it's hard to see it assuming the proportions of the Mau Mau in Kenya, or the rebellions against the Portuguese in Angola or Mozambique. This Rhodesian terrorism is organized in Lusaka, capital of neighboring Zambia, by members of ZANU, the outlawed Zimbabwe African National Union. The terrorists come across the Zambezi River, discovered by Livingstone a century ago, which forms the border between Zambia and Rhodesia for hundreds of miles. It flows through wild country, and it's almost impossible to stop movement across the river. In the past 3 or 4 months, several gangs of terrorists armed with Chinese automatic weapons, and each said to carry 200 pounds in Rhodesian money, have crossed the river and struck out through the bush with a twin mission: to kill white Rhodesians and to build up a terrorist movement inside the country.
Bandakanda bhuzi rangu sezvizvi nemwana riti down
kuona sokuti vakazoperegwa namabara vari panguva pokutizira zvehavachina.
Ndakabata ura hwangu ndikadonhera pasi nokuti ndandikachagoni kuenda mberi, ndobva ndawira pasi, ndobva ndazvibvunza ndikati ndokunonzi kufa here.
Iyapo ndakarwadziwa nokuti ndakaziva kuti baba vangu nokusapota kwavaita magandanga ndiye munhu waifanira kutanga kurehwa nana Dr. Zulu nana Chauya Chinesu naSandokan.
Kana munhu abatwa ana akunzi mukamuona auya pasi naye
Liberty Wine vakamuka kuti kunyepa, vakatarisa pawaya, vakadini, vakatendera, vakatarisa dzimba dzese. Ko mujibha waya vakambomuona kuti waenda, vakangozoti papa kusina mujibha waenda.
It is critical to remember that the Southern Front, or Gaza province, was the Rhodesians' lifeline.
They were heroes. But to then be captured and come back and rejoin your comrades, there is no greater heroism than that. These are legends.
By 1978, Zanla forces, fighting from its rear bases in Mozambique, had established 3 operational provinces in the front, namely Tete, Manica, and Gaza. Known as Operation Repulse, the Rhodesian operation in Gaza province was meant to protect her vital economic interests and also routes to ally South Africa. The war had reached unprecedented levels. However, despite Rhodesian forces being overstretched, they were also determined to keep defending vital economic resources. Rhodesia completely failed to contain Zanla infiltrations despite their desperate measures. It is in Berengwa district, Sector 2 of Gaza province, and Sadza area of the Monomotapa sector of Manica province, some of the hottest theaters of war then, where we find some Zanla war legends emerging. The Rhodesians had wrongly named Gaza province the Russian front. In fact, the Chinese were the main backers of the Zanla war effort in terms of training and equipment. Comrades Sando Kano, Zhu Chichatonga, and others had become famous due to their daring attacks on the Rhodesian security forces and other economic targets. Their enemies knew them by name. Whenever Rhodesian forces interrogated civilians, they would ask for their whereabouts. In fact, they had become legendary.
Pani batira mataga, machif mataga, ilmumberengwa. Imataiti sisu sector 2, disame de 2 zekari. Injumbo yegara masoja aine samjumbo ino shakanyanya stereti. Sakata yegara chiwa pano chipa chaka.
Wawenga waiburitsa moroporo dzavo dzichibva mumapuri aya amuri kuona pane matombo apa. Ndio mwaiburitsa pfuti dzavo. Waisauroeka nepfuti dzedu zvakaitwa masabu. Waitoroeka nedzekupotsera vanadurirana mbuya nehandariya. Gondora yawapindira mwengo wari. Masabu kuti tipinzeni papo aibondera.
Tanti ni Morotero yanga yakamaundwa ya type Shimborwani mota 60 but yanga ya hombe mota 82 utende doji pachikamarada. Saka tatora maposition tiri momo ndabanda rova chichimba ndakanda buzz rangu sezvizvi ndibanda riti down roba ranopinda ndakanda rimwe ndibanda to adjust very fast ndibanda kanda sideways ndibanda kanda pakati handenda pedza basa ipapo ndakutosumuka ndakutobaya zvangu
futi handifungi kuti upenyu hwangu ndakambonzwa futi inorira chidaro kana ende ndakafunga kuti vakomana vauya kuzondiuraya here zvaita sei pakaere pakati.
As a result of Rhodesian forces having been hammered at Mataga camp and other areas of Mberengwa, they decided to respond against Zanla.
Honde Pastor Ndido pamadhafu honde handife ndakaikanganwa honde takasurprisewa nemuvengi tichingoti svikei pabhesi makuseni muvengi vakabva vauya nemahelicopters inini ndaingobva ndaitobva kuzasi kunde ndichibva kunonamata sakomandadzi tainamata muhonde imomo.
It was routine for comrades to seek guidance from the ancestral spirits, Vadzimu. Quite often, during the Second Chimurenga War, the spirit world would intervene to warn the guerrillas of impending danger.
Ndakasangana nedendera richifamba mbichana zombe ndikati kombuya vari kufamba vakadai ava chii handaupedza muromo wene chingonosvika pacommanding post pangu denga ranga razara zvikopokopo aviona dzakutopomba.
It would appear that they had much intelligence about the movements of Comrade Sando and his group. Hence, their response was massive.
Saka makomrades vakabva varamura fog futi dzakatanga kurira inini semunhu akanga ndine mabhuzu angu tanga tingosvika ndine mabhuzu angu 5 ndakazoshandisa ndichibhomba kwaideploywa nemadhakota nemahelicopters kusvika mabhuzu angu apera.
This particular day produced a fierce battle.
Hondo yakaitika panapa pano pastondido base yekinge iri hondo yakatinetsa ngekuti tenge tisina kuzofungira kuti izo pachaita hondo yakadari. Apa tenge tabva kuita hondo kurodhi uko tenge taita imwe hondo yechipiri yacho teita ndorova masikuzi kuseri uko masikuzi apo inga akawanda. Saka magariro atakaita pano pabhesi takandoti tisogara chete pano pabhesi hapana munhu akamboti kana mvura kana kuti chinyi. Ndopo takakunzwa saundi. Tatakakunzwa saundi iyi ndakatoti zvimwe chinyi igodzi train iri kunangumbani iri kudzika kutriangle. Tozoona kuti pasina some seconds mahelicopter azara vhamba yakutanga kupotsera muradius kuti izo uko ichikanda bhomba uko ichikanda bhomba. Izvi yaiitira chinyi yaiitira vamwe wavo kuti wanyatsoona ndo pakagara chinyi pakagara magandanga.
During attacks, the civilians, also known as collaborators or POVO, were exposed to great danger.
Makomredi yapo ari kudogadzirwa chikafu anasandokana nanazulu vabva vaya vati kusha madhodini kati anyway sadza ri kutoita tiri imomo mukati mebhesi taona ice tati iri mudenga todova pabhesi tose iri mudenga iri mudenga nguva ngani taona sarova zvifamba swadisa mureza panda paya tichisumuka uyu achibuda akadai umwe achibuda pakadai vamwe achitarira pakadai kumavirira avo
musi wacho uyu karisika kanga isinda kangadai taendaenda kuchikoro taendaenda kumombe kunzoko kazongoona ndege dzauya makomere dzanga ari mamugomo takutoona kuti takutotanga kurira vanhu vakutomhanya vamwe vaibva nokukuku vachiratidza kuti vakuvara musikana wepapapa akanga atopfurwa vamwe tangowana chimanya mugomo imomo.
Ndo yaiva kicheni yedu panapa tabika sadza redu takabva tapedza pakutoti vana toti zvino vasikana vana chimhwido chisherai vana sadza vachirya isu vabiki vana mai vokubika tatopedza.